In 1922, Eddie Rickenbacker sat across from Hermann Göring in Berlin. When the time came, Göring said, they would put all three together and Germany would be reborn through the air. The former German fighter pilot outlined a chilling blueprint: gliding as a sport, commercial planes convertible to military use, the skeleton of a new air force. Rickenbacker knew what he was hearing. The first notes of a war the world refused to acknowledge. That warning had its roots in a hero's homecoming 3 years earlier, in February 1919. In February of 1919, Captain Eddie Rickenbacker came home to a hero's welcome that masked a troubling truth. The most decorated American airman of the Great War, with 26 victories, stepped off the troopship Adriatic to find a nation that had already turned its back on air power. At a glittering banquet in the Waldorf Astoria, a dignitary pinned a set of gold flyer's wings onto his chest, studded with diamonds and sapphires. Rickenbacker held the jeweled prize toward his mother in the gallery, and the room erupted in a standing ovation. But the cheers could not hide the fact that the United States ranked a humiliating seventh among the world's air powers. 3 years later, Rickenbacker found himself in Berlin, sitting across from a man who would change history. The former German fighter pilot Hermann Göring laid out a chilling blueprint for rebuilding the German Empire. They would teach gliding as a sport, build commercial planes easily converted to military use, and create the skeleton of a new air force. When the time came, Göring said they would put all three together and Germany would be reborn through the air. While Rickenbacker carried warnings across America, a young man named Charles Lindbergh entered the Army Flying School at Brooks Field, Texas. He graduated at the top of his class in 1925, then signed on as an airmail pilot, flying the treacherous St. Louis to Chicago route. Twice that year, fog and engine failure forced him to bail out of his plane in the darkness, once landing in a cornfield and once on a barbed wire fence. Each time he survived, and in the long, solitary hours of night flying, he began to calculate how far a plane could travel if every inch were filled with fuel. In the autumn of 1925, Rickenbacker took the stand at the court martial of General Billy Mitchell, who had dared to demand a separate air force. He told the court that the United States ranked seventh in aviation power, behind France, England, Italy, Germany, Russia, and Japan. He excoriated the military brass for denying pilots parachutes and for sending them into combat with obsolete foreign planes. This nation owes General Mitchell a debt of gratitude for daring to speak the truth, Rickenbacker said, and it will pay the price of its selfishness. By the winter of 1927, Charles Lindbergh had left the airmail service and was in San Diego, overseeing the construction of a special long-range monoplane. He had calculated that a single-engine plane, stripped of everything except fuel, could reach Paris. The Ryan Aeronautical Company agreed to build it. The chief engineer, Donald Hall, designed a fuselage with a single cockpit placed behind the main fuel tank. Lindbergh insisted on a wicker pilot's seat. It weighed less than a third of a leather one. Every pound saved meant more gasoline. On the morning of May 20th, the Spirit of St. Louis sat on the soggy runway at Roosevelt Field. The plane carried 380 gallons of fuel. Lindbergh pushed the throttle open. The overloaded monoplane lurched forward, barely climbing above the telephone wires at the end of the field. He crossed the coast of Long Island at 8 in the morning. For 33 and a half hours, he fought fog, ice, and his own exhaustion. Hallucinations came and went. He kept flying east. At 10:22 on the night of May 21st, he touched down at Le Bourget Field in Paris. A crowd of more than 100,000 broke through the barriers and surged around the plane. They carried Lindbergh on their shoulders. He had won the $25,000 Orteig Prize. Within days, President Coolidge awarded him the Distinguished Flying Cross and a full colonel's commission. The Spirit of St. Louis, its fabric skin still bearing the signatures of the workers who built it, had become the most famous aircraft in the world. Enjoying the story? Subscribe to join us for the next one. Lindbergh returned to the United States in June aboard the cruiser Memphis. The New York City Street Cleaning Department later reported it had picked up 2,000 pounds of ticker tape and confetti from the parade. But he did not stop to rest. With backing from the Guggenheim Fund for the Promotion of Aeronautics, he agreed to take the Spirit of St. Louis on a 3-month tour of America. The goal was to sell aviation to the American people. He flew 22,350 miles over the summer and fall. He visited all 48 states and stopped in 82 cities. At each airfield, crowds gathered by the tens of thousands. He shook hands, gave speeches, and took local officials for rides. He inspected airport sites and promoted the idea of commercial air travel. When he finally landed back at Mitchell Field in October, an estimated 1 in every 4 Americans had seen him in person. The tour did more than make Lindbergh a household name. It convinced the public that flying was safe and practical. Airlines began to see a future in passenger service. Lindbergh himself earned $250,000 in book royalties from his account of the flight, titled We. He had become, at 25, the most famous man in the world and the most effective salesman aviation had ever known. While Lindbergh was crossing the Atlantic, Eddie Rickenbacker was trying to rebuild his own life. His automobile company, the Rickenbacker Motor Company, had gone bankrupt in 1927. He was $250,000 in debt. He refused to file for personal bankruptcy. He intended to pay every dollar back, even if it took years. An opportunity came when the owner of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway offered to sell the track. Rickenbacker had raced there before the war and knew its value. He found a banker who backed a bond issue, and he bought a controlling interest. He resurfaced the old brick track with asphalt. He added an 18-hole golf course to generate year-round revenue. Most important, he persuaded NBC to broadcast the Indianapolis 500 live on national radio. The Speedway gave Rickenbacker a foothold. He also took a job as a sales executive at General Motors, traveling constantly to visit dealerships. He used every spare dollar to pay down his debt. He was not yet back in aviation, but he was making himself ready. The Speedway would be his base of operations for the next 2 decades. In December 1927, Lindbergh flew the Spirit of St. Louis to Mexico City on a goodwill mission. He was a guest of the American ambassador, Dwight Morrow. At the embassy, he met Morrow's 21-year-old daughter, Anne. She was a shy, intelligent Smith College graduate. Later that night, she wrote in her diary that she was silenced and amazed by him. He was, she wrote, a very refined face, not at all like those grinning Lindy pictures. Over the next year, Lindbergh courted her quietly. He taught her to fly and to operate a radio. They were married on May 27, 1929, in a secret ceremony at the Morrow estate in Englewood, New Jersey. Even the guests thought they were coming to a reception. The couple slipped out the back, drove a borrowed car to a waiting yacht, and escaped up the Long Island Sound. Reporters tracked them for weeks. Anne Morrow Lindbergh soon became a pilot and a radio operator herself. She flew with her husband on survey flights and wrote books that would later become bestsellers. The marriage was a partnership of equals, even if the press saw her only as the hero's wife. She understood the cost of his fame better than anyone. She would need that understanding soon enough. The man who solved one of aviation's deadliest problems was James Doolittle. In 1929, he was a 32-year-old first lieutenant with a Ph.D. in aeronautical engineering from MIT. He had been hired by the Guggenheim Fund to work at the full flight laboratory at Mitchell Field. The problem was fog. Pilots had no way to land when they could not see the ground. Doolittle believed that a combination of new instruments and radio beacons could solve it. On September 24, 1929, a thick fog rolled in over Long Island. Doolittle climbed into a consolidated NY-2 Husky. A canvas hood covered the cockpit so he could see nothing outside but his instrument panel. He took off, flew a 15-mile course, turned, and made his approach. 2 vibrating radio reeds in his earphones told him when he was on course. A new altimeter from Paul Colesman gave him his height above the ground. He landed without ever seeing the runway. The New York Times declared the next morning that man's greatest enemy in the air, fog, was conquered. Doolittle was more cautious. He said more work was needed, but he had proved the principle. Commercial airlines could now promise scheduled flights in all weather. It was, he later said, my most significant contribution to aviation. The age of blind flying had begun. The Army brass who had silenced Billy Mitchell continued to ignore warnings about air power, leaving the nation unprepared for the wars to come. On June 23, 1931, James Doolittle took the Travel Air mystery ship up at a local air show near St. Louis. As he pulled up from a low pass at nearly 300 miles per hour, the airframe let out an ominous crack of breaking metal. The wings began to splinter, and the aileron snapped off in midair. Doolittle wrestled the controls for a desperate moment, then scrambled out of the cockpit and pulled his ripcord. He was so low he watched his own plane hit the ground and explode half a mile away as his feet touched Earth. It was one of the lowest unplanned parachute jumps in history. Later that same year, flying a Laird Super Solution, he won the Bendix Trophy with a record flight time of 9 hours and 10 minutes to Cleveland. He pocketed $10,000 in prize money, making up for the loss of the mystery ship and moving on to Shell Oil's aviation division. On the evening of March 1st, 1932, Charles Lindbergh was reading in the library of his new home in Hopewell, New Jersey. Around 9 o'clock, he heard a thud from outside, like a wooden box dropping. He thought nothing of it and continued reading. At 10 o'clock, the nursemaid Betty Gow went to check on 20-month-old Charles Jr. She found the crib empty and the window slightly open, with a white envelope resting on the sill. The envelope contained a ransom note demanding $50,000 with a strange symbol of two interlocking circles. Lindbergh paid through an intermediary, but the kidnappers did not return the child. On May 12th, a truck driver stumbled upon the decomposed remains of a small child in the woods a few miles from Hopewell. The clothing matched what the baby had worn the night he was taken. The autopsy revealed a fractured skull, likely caused when the kidnapper dropped him during the escape from the ladder, a sound that may have been the thud Lindbergh heard that night. In September of 1934, a marked bill from the ransom money turned up at a bank in the Bronx. The license plate number written on its margin led police to Bruno Richard Hauptmann, a German-born carpenter and former machine gunner in the German army. Hidden in the wall of his garage, they found more than $10,000 of the ransom money in his attic. A missing floorboard matched the exact dimensions of a rail from the homemade extension ladder left at the crime scene. The ladder was a crude three-section contraption built from common pine, its wood grain later traced by a Forest Service expert to a specific lumberyard in the Bronx. Hauptmann's trial in Flemington, New Jersey became a national sensation, drawing crowds, reporters, and rubberneckers from across the country. He was convicted, maintaining his innocence. The case spawned decades of controversy, with questions lingering about whether he acted alone. For the Lindberghs, the horror of the crime and the relentless press attention that followed had already made life in America untenable. In December of 1935, under cover of darkness, Charles Lindbergh led his wife Anne and their young son John down to the West Side docks of Manhattan. They boarded a cargo vessel called the American Importer, bound for England. There were no farewell speeches, no news cameras. The family who had once been America's most celebrated was slipping away in silence. Hauptmann was executed in April 1936, but the Lindberghs never looked back. They settled first in Wales, then leased Long Barn, a 15th-century cottage in the Kent countryside not far from London. For a time, Lindbergh found the privacy that had eluded him in America. He returned to his work on a perfusion pump with Dr. Alexis Carroll, trying to solve the problem of keeping organs alive outside the body. The quiet did not last. In the summer of 1936, Lindbergh accepted an invitation from Hermann Göring to attend the Berlin Olympics and tour the new Luftwaffe. He walked through aircraft factories that were producing warplanes at a furious rate, hidden from the eyes of the world. What he saw left him shaken. Germany, he concluded, was building the most powerful air force in Europe, and she meant to use it. In 1937, James Doolittle crossed the Atlantic for Shell Oil in Germany. He looked up his old friend Ernst Udet, the Luftwaffe's director of aircraft production. Udet, once the happy-go-lucky daredevil of the air shows, seemed subdued and uneasy. He gave Doolittle access to the plants where Junkers, Heinkel, and Messerschmitt were building their machines. Doolittle flew the Me-109 fighter himself and recognized at once that German technology had pulled ahead of America's. Lindbergh returned to Germany again in October 1938. On the night of the 18th, at a dinner in the American Embassy, Hermann Göring presented him with a small velveteen box. Inside lay the Order of the German Eagle, a gold and enamel cross awarded by Hitler himself for service to aviation. Lindbergh accepted it politely, but Anne saw the trouble coming. She called it the Albatross. Weeks later, the Nazis unleashed Kristallnacht, and the medal became a scandal that would darken Lindbergh's name. When Doolittle returned home, he went straight to Washington and reported to General Hap Arnold. He told Arnold that Germany was preparing for a major war and that American air strength was dangerously behind. Arnold believed him, but the warnings were largely downplayed by officials who did not want to hear that Hitler had already surpassed them. Doolittle left the meeting frustrated, knowing time was running out. On September 1st, 1939, German tanks and dive bombers rolled into Poland. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war. Lindbergh, now back in the United States, went on national radio on the 15th and urged America to stay out. He argued that another European war would destroy Western civilization and that the United States must not be drawn in. The speech won approval from millions of Americans who remembered the costs of the last war. But the tide was beginning to turn. Doolittle quietly offered to return to active duty and began advising the Army Air Corps on technical needs. Eddie Rickenbacker, running Eastern Airlines, shifted his public stance as well. He had voted for Roosevelt and once opposed intervention, but the fall of France and the bombing of London changed his mind. America's greatest aviators were moving toward the same conclusion. The war would eventually come to them. On the evening of February 26, 1941, Eddie Rickenbacker boarded an Eastern Airlines DC-3 called the Mexico Flyer in Newark. The weather was foul, rain, wind, cold. Rickenbacker settled into the Sky Lounge behind the cockpit, hoping to get some paperwork done. The plane carried 13 passengers and a crew of 3, bound for Atlanta and points beyond. Approaching Atlanta around midnight, the pilot received permission to land. He put the left wing down for a standard 180-degree turn toward the runway. Then the wing struck the tops of pine trees. The pilot jerked the left wing up, but the right wing began hitting trees. The right wing tore off the fuselage. The plane veered violently, flipped up on its nose and somersaulted into a ravine, shearing in half where Rickenbacker sat. Rickenbacker was pinned in the wreckage, crushed against the dead body of the steward. His left elbow was shattered, his skull was dented, his pelvis was broken in 2 places, and his ribs had snapped off and poked through his torso. Gasoline flowed everywhere. Someone in the darkness said, "Let's build a bonfire." Rickenbacker screamed, "For God's sake, don't light a match." He remained conscious through the night, reassuring the dying passengers near him. At dawn, rescuers cut him free. His eyeball had been popped from its socket and was dangling on his cheek. A doctor shoved it back in and sewed up the eyelid without anesthetic. Rickenbacker would spend 4 months in Piedmont Hospital, but he survived. 2 months later, in April 1941, Charles Lindbergh faced his own crisis. The rift with President Roosevelt had reached its breaking point. During a press conference, Roosevelt compared Lindbergh to a copperhead, a Civil War term for a Northerner who sympathized with the South. Lindbergh was incensed. A point of honor was involved. He wrote in his journal. His commission as a colonel in the Army Air Corps had always meant a great deal to him, but he could not serve under a president who would call him a traitor. Lindbergh weighed the decision over a weekend. He talked it over with friends like Colonel Truman Smith, who advised against resigning. But on Sunday evening, with a heavy heart, Lindbergh wrote to the president. He said he felt no honorable alternative but to resign his commission. The resignation made front-page news. Lindbergh had severed his last official tie to the military. He was now a civilian, free to speak his mind, and speak he would, with consequences he could not yet foresee. He continued his work with the America First Committee, determined to keep the United States out of the European war. On September 11, 1941, Lindbergh stepped to a microphone in Des Moines, Iowa. Before a crowd of 8,000, he delivered a speech titled, "Who are the War Agitators?" He named 3 groups he believed were pushing America toward war: the Roosevelt administration, the British, and the Jews. When Anne learned what he planned to say, she was thrown into black gloom. She tried to talk him out of it, but Charles would not be moved. Lindbergh said no person with the dignity of mankind could condone the persecution of the Jewish race in Germany. But he added that Jewish groups in America should be opposing war, not agitating for it. The crowd gave him a standing ovation. The next day, the reaction was savage. He was called a Nazi, an anti-Semite, a traitor. His name was removed from streets and schools across the country. TWA expunged the Lindbergh line from its stationery. Lindbergh insisted he was not anti-Semitic. His friend Harry Guggenheim said publicly that Lindbergh never had the slightest anti-Semitic feeling. But the damage was done. The speech permanently damaged his reputation. He offered to resign from America First, but the committee refused to accept it. Lindbergh, the stubborn Swede, refused to retract a single word. December 7, 1941. Japanese carrier plane struck the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The attack was a complete surprise. The Pacific Fleet was devastated the next day. The United States declared war on Japan. 3 days later, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. The arguments of the America First Committee were rendered moot. For Lindbergh, the news was devastating. Here was a war he believed in fighting, but he had resigned his commission. He immediately offered his services to the Army Air Forces. He was rejected. His previous statements about the war agitators had made him untouchable. The man who had been the most famous aviator in the world was now an outcast, unable to serve his country in its hour of need. James Doolittle, who had been quietly advising the Army Air Corps, immediately returned to active duty with the rank of colonel. Eddie Rickenbacker, still recovering from his crash but determined to serve, began working with General Hap Arnold to boost morale and production. He would soon embark on a dangerous mission to the Pacific Theater. The war had come, and each of these men would find his own path back into the fight. After the war, Lindbergh lived quietly as a consultant to Pan American Airways in the Air Force, writing books and championing conservation. His earlier work with Dr. Alexis Carrel on a perfusion pump later contributed to the development of the artificial heart, but that scientific achievement was overshadowed by the kidnapping tragedy that had shattered his family. Bruno Richard Hauptmann, convicted for that crime, was executed in 1936, maintaining his innocence to the last. Ernst Udet, his old rival and friend from the German side, took his own life in November 1941, as the war machine he helped build began to turn on itself. Doolittle rose to command the 8th Air Force, leading the famous raid on Tokyo in 1942 that bore his name. Rickenbacker returned to Eastern Airlines, building it into one of the nation's great carriers. Each of them, in his own way, had been tested by fire, and each had found a measure of redemption. Their stories remind us that heroes are not perfect. They make mistakes, they fall from grace. But what defines them is not the fall, it is the return. If you have family stories from the World War II era, or memories of these aviators and their legacy, we would love to hear them in the comments below. Please subscribe to the channel and give this video a like to support our historical documentaries. Thank you for listening.